chatter has stopped, so I guess that's my cue to say welcome to all of you. My name is Hank Clark. I'm program coordinator of the Political Economy Project, and it's a delight to see all of you here today. Just a couple of very brief program notes about the PEP coming up. We have, I believe, at least 4 public events remaining in the fall term. 2 next week. On Monday, Larry Summers will be here at 12:30 in Rocky 3, a conversation about the current economy. And then the very next day, Greg Reichberg will be coming from the Oslo Peace Research Institute to discuss the question of whether robots should be making war and peace decisions on the battlefield. And that's a 4:30 in the afternoon talk on Tuesday, the 22nd of October. Check out our website for other events the week after and the week after that as well. But turning to tonight's event, this event with Mayor Kohn is the second in a series called Understanding the Economy that the Political Economy Project is pleased and honored to be hosting this year. Mayor will be speaking twice in the fall, twice again in the winter, and twice also in the spring term. That's the plan anyway. Those of you who missed his first talk, Is Finance Theft?, can find a YouTube recording of it on our website. That was on September the 26th. I've been reading Malthus this afternoon, and I'm going to resist the temptation to tell you what the phrase the Malthusian trap actually means. It might sound dauntingly technical. I'm sure Professor Kohn will enlighten us, and I'm sure he'll make sure we understand it is not so terribly technical. But in any case, it was a great pleasure to have him speak on the 26th of September. It's a great pleasure to have him here this evening. Without any further ado, won't you please join me in welcoming Mayor Kohn.
Thank you. Thank you, Hank. My thanks to the PEP for sponsoring this lecture series, and for Hank for organizing it. So, a central theme of the series is that understanding the economy requires not just or even mainly standard economics. There are some important things that standard economics leaves out, and I'm on the whole going to focus on those and why they're important. So the important thing of today is predation, and I will presently explain what that is. We're going to be looking at this in the context of what holds back economic progress, okay? And we'll see there's several questions related to it that we'll look at in a little bit more detail, okay? And the standard explanation of economics for what holds back, if there's some, for example, we'll talk about why are poor countries poor? Okay, so a standard explanation for that is the Malthusian trap, which again I'll get to in a minute and explain. And I'm going to argue that that's wrong, that there probably is no such thing. There's certainly no evidence of it. And what is really holding back economic progress, for example, the problem of developing countries, is the predation trap, okay? And we'll see also that predation has a lot to do with government, and so it's very often, it's actually just the other day, some people got a Nobel Prize in economics for talking about failings of government and how that holds back economic progress. So it's tough. And we'll come to them also as we continue. So let's start off just very briefly talking about the Malthusian trap, okay? And I defer to Hank on his expertise on what, I'll give you just a very simplified version of it. So the story is that something, technological progress typically is sort of the typical culprit, raises incomes. The result of higher incomes is that people have more children and the population grows. The growing population, there's more labor and it produces more output, but unfortunately, natural resources are kind of fixed. Okay, they don't grow. And with more people with the same natural resources, land in particular is what Malthus was talking about, productivity per person goes down. And as a result, income per person falls, population growth slows, and in fact, population may fall a bit. And this process stabilizes at the level of subsistence. So really, people are stuck at the level of subsistence in poor countries, and historically in countries that are now rich but used to be poor. Okay, that was what was holding things back. So the Malthusian trap is the common answer to three big questions about economic progress. The first of them is about what is called the great enrichment. So it is claimed, and we'll see it's not exactly right, but it's claimed that from the beginning, from the cavemen until Jane Austen about, income didn't go up, okay? And we were stuck in the Malthusian trap. And then the Industrial Revolution happened. And the result, it was also the result, there was sort of rapid technological progress that kept ahead of population growth. And things have been great ever since. So they sort of draw a diagram with flat income for thousands of years. And then the Industrial Revolution, it picks up and keeps going. Okay. Why did it go up? The standard story is, the Enlightenment and science, and that caused rapid technological progress. Okay, that's sort of the story. Okay, so that's one question, what is called the great enrichment. The second question I already mentioned, why are poor countries poor? Very short answer, they're stuck in the Malthusian trap. So to escape the Malthusian trap, they need slower population growth and faster technological progress, and everything will be fine. And then the third question that we're going to look at is, what is the biggest threat to our own continued prosperity? So things have been going well since the Industrial Revolution. What could go wrong? And in the 70s, the early 70s, there was a very popular book called Limits to Growth by Donella Meadows, who was then at Dartmouth. This book warned that of environmental and economic collapse if population expansion and economic growth continued on their present path. Okay? So those are sort of the three questions, and the answer of all of them is essentially the Malthusian trap. But in each case, it's the wrong answer. And I'll explain briefly why. So the great enrichment, the story is just not consistent with the evidence. Economic historians have sort of looked at what actually happened in these periods. We'll see, first of all, it wasn't flat. There were ups. It was going up and down, up and down, up and down. Okay, there was no sign of decreasing labor productivity. Things weren't stuck at subsistence. A lot of the details of the Malthusian trap story just didn't happen that way. And none of the periods when things were going up were ended by a shortage of land. In fact, they were all ended by wars. Okay. So what was different with the Industrial Revolution, that despite the wars continued. The wars didn't stop. They got worse, actually. We'll see why in a minute. But economic progress continued anyhow. So the wars didn't stop it. That's what happened. If we look at development, many countries have developed without addressing the so-called population problem. Okay. There's only one country that tried, and that was China. Mao was clearly impressed by limits to growth, and he introduced the one-child policy in China after reading it. That hasn't gone well. I think they really regret that now. They have the opposite problem at the moment. And on the big threat of the limits to growth, there's a famous wager on this. Okay, one of the people who was pushing this idea was Paul Ehrlich, a biologist, and Julian Simon, an economist, said, "Put your money where your mouth is." Okay, let's take a bet. Okay, I bet you're wrong about all this. And so what Ehrlich was saying is resources should get more and more expensive as we got into this new, Malthusian trap. And Simon said, "I'll bet you the opposite. I'll bet you if we take a bunch of resources, and the bet will be that I will bet that all of their prices will be lower in 20 years than they are now, not higher." And Ehrlich said, "Great, I'll be happy to take your money." They made the bet, and who won the bet? Simon. All of the prices of 5 different metals, they all fell over that period. Okay, there was no increasing scarcity. So Dumas had to switch to a different problem, so that's when climate change became a major concern. But this was the climate change of the 70s, the equivalent. Okay, so let's turn now to predation, the predation trap, and the connection with government. Okay, this is what I want to talk about. So the idea of predation is very simple. It's using force to take stuff from others. That's what I mean, predation. On the poster, I don't know if you saw the poster for this event, there was a really, I was going to say nice lion. Nice isn't the right word. A very predatory looking lion. That was a very nice photo. When we're talking about economic predation, when you take stuff from people, you don't actually have to eat them. Okay, it's just their goods that you're taking from them. As the highwayman used to say, your money or your life. Okay, so if you hand over the money, you can keep your life. So predation is an economic activity, a way of making a living. That's what economics doesn't really recognize this. Okay, in standard economics, people make a living by production. And in the previous lecture, last time, we saw that actually people also make a very good living in commerce. And finance is an example of that. So a good chunk of the economy are people employed in finance. And we'll see a good chunk of the economy is people employed in predation and making a very good living. We'll see how. All right, so I'm in the finishing stages of a long project that I've been working on to understand economic progress. And an important part of that was I studied pre-industrial Europe to understand how economic progress worked there. It's much simpler, and it's easier to see what's going on. One of the things I noticed was there were 3 social and economic classes. Okay, peasants and artisans who made their living from production, merchants who made their living from commerce, finance as an example, and the so-called nobility who made their money through predation. okay, using force to take stuff from people. So what is the predation trap? Economic progress creates new opportunities for predation. Okay? Entrepreneurs of predation grab these new opportunities, and this eventually chokes off the economic progress that gave rise to it, and that's the closing of the predation trap. That's not the end of the story generally. The economy is not helpless in the face of this. People find ways to protect themselves, to get around, to avoid the predation, and eventually things pick up again, okay? And there's new economic growth, and same story gets repeated, okay, over and over. That was what happened historically. So the idea of the predation trap is far from being new. It goes back at least to Montesquieu, Smith, and Tocqueville. I know many other authors of that period and later who talked about predation and the predation trap. Again, it's Hank's department, those figures. All right. So what I'll talk about next, and is very important, is the connection between predation and government. So the origin of government is very much an example of the predation trap at work. Okay, when was government, did it first appear? Some describe it as the first states. Okay, it appeared with sedentary agriculture. With sedentary agriculture, it made sense, it was feasible for a group of armed men to take over and control a population and collect tribute from them. When they were hunters and gatherers, you couldn't do that. They would just move, they would go. They wouldn't stay there. You couldn't stop them from escaping. But with sedentary agriculture, they were kind of stuck with their fields and their crops. And this was the beginning of government. It was actually particularly in places where it was hard for them to move, like the Nile Valley is a good example. That's a great place to take over, and if any of you have been there, you can see the desert on either side, okay? There's really nowhere to go. Someone wrote a very good article about some of the first states being in valleys in the Andes. You're surrounded by mountains, same thing. Okay, so the fact that people are restricted in their movement makes it possible to take them over and collect tribute from them, okay, engage in predation. Okay. Okay, this type of government I call, for obvious reasons, predatory government. It's created for the purpose of predation, okay? And we'll see, for example, most governments in poor countries are of this type, okay? This isn't good for them, but it's unfortunately a fact. So the second part of the predation trap is some sort of reaction. And some populations organize to defend themselves against these armed groups who are always trying to expand their territory. And they organize themselves to deploy force of their own, most notably commercial cities. There were already commercial cities. They weren't grand, but they existed. They were relatively wealthy, relatively large populations. They got together, they organized, they built city walls, they raised a militia, and they protected themselves, generally quite effectively. This kind of government I call associational government, okay? And It also existed in villages. Okay, villages also had their own associational governments, much smaller, but they also actually, by villagers getting together, they were not totally helpless against predatory governments. So government is not one thing, but two very different things, okay? Predatory government is imposed from above. Its purpose is predation on the population by the rulers, by those who control the government. Associational government is created from below by a population to protect it against predation, okay? And it answers to that population. Our government is a form of association. If it sounds familiar, it's a form of associational government. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So the final thing I want to say here is that government itself is not immune to predation. So governments involve the employment of agents. Okay, the ruler can't do it. He's got a big territory. He has people representing him all over the territory. They look out for themselves. They should be looking out for his interests, but they also will look out for their own. And the result, corruption is a common kind of predation. Sometimes they break away and become independent rulers, or they try and take over from the ruler. Okay, so that's a problem for predatory governments. Associational governments have their own problems. The agent here is really the leader appointed by the population. You need to have sort of an executive to run the defense, the military. And the leader, again, if you don't keep an eye on him, will tend to do things in his own interest. And the result sometimes is that associational governments degenerate into predatory governments. Florence is sort of a good example, okay, with the Medicis. They were essentially hereditary rulers of Florence. They owned it, okay, in the way that predatory governments do. Okay, so let's use the P trap, the predation trap, to answer our three questions. So we're going to look at Europe, how the predation trap works. The main source of predation was governments, especially predatory governments, as I've described. And the main form of government predation was related to wars. It wasn't the wars themselves doing damage. Wars in those days were very small affairs, small armies, not very impressive weapons. But financing wars was a big issue. Okay? Rulers had to find the resources to finance the wars. And they very quickly had to resort to methods that were very destructive of their economies. So the typical story was that there's a period of peace where rulers accumulated a fair amount of resources. And they thought, this is a good time to go to war to acquire more territory. They wanted more territory. And the reason for that is it was sort of a survival of the largest. Okay, bigger predatory governments generally defeated in war smaller ones. So it was good to get bigger. And if you didn't, they would. So that was sort of the environment in Europe. And so they launched a war. The increasing extraction of resources harmed their economies, ended economic progress, reduced the revenue, they ran out of money, and the wars ended. Then you had a period of peace, things would pick up again, repeat. Okay, that was sort of the ups and downs. How did Europe escape this predation trap to get the great enrichment? So what was different about the rise in the Industrial Revolution was not that it was so much bigger than earlier increases in economic progress. What was different about it was it didn't end. It just went on and on and on for centuries till today. Okay, there hadn't been anything like that before. So the question is why? Why was it possible it escaped the predation trap, is essentially what we're saying. The reason it did was that a new form of government evolved which was able to finance its war without destroying the economy. This gave it a very big advantage over the others, okay? And this kind of government, which I call the associational state, came into being, emerged in the Dutch Republic in the 16th century, okay? And it was, how did they finance their war without destroying the economy? They borrowed. Okay, finance. Those of you who were here last time, finance to the rescue. Okay, because they were able to borrow. The predatory governments tried to borrow, and they did borrow a bit, but their credit stank. Okay, you wouldn't lend to them. So they very quickly defaulted on their debt and couldn't borrow anymore. The associational state was run by merchants. They understood credit. They understood how you behave, how to manage your affairs. They paid back the money they borrowed so they could continue to borrow, okay? So this arose first of all in the Dutch Republic. It was adopted by England after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Not formally, the English don't do formal constitutions, but functionally, it was sort of organized in the same way as the Dutch Republic. And then eventually, by the United States, in 1787 with Constitutional Convention. And the Constitution was actually very consciously modeled on the Dutch Republic. There's a literature on that. We don't hear about it much, but that's where they got the idea. Because it was the same kind of thing, like the states in the United States. The Dutch Republic was also a collection of provinces that were put together in a federal structure. That's what distinguishes the associational state. So the associational states won all the major wars and came to dominate the West. They were very hospitable to economic progress. That's what caused this great enrichment. There were still wars, and the wars were actually bigger, because if you can borrow the money, you can afford a bigger war, a bigger army, and so on and so forth. And the war actually became more destructive, but didn't affect economic progress very much. That continued unabated. All right. Next thing I want to talk about, why no great enrichment in China? Why didn't this happen in China? So this is another question in economic history. It's called the Great Divergence, not the Great Enrichment. So way back, China was much richer than Europe, okay? And Europe sort of got richer slowly, okay, and then fast. And China didn't. Okay, so what's the story? This is also explained by the predation trap. So let me just give you a quick description. So China evolved a form of government very early, about 200 BC, that was especially inhospitable to economic progress. It was a very powerful predatory government which relied on its revenue for its revenue on a command economy. Okay, it managed a command economy. It looks a lot like communism in that respect. Its economy, and it not only didn't encourage commerce, it tried to suppress it, because it thought that commerce would mess up its command economy, would sort of lure people away from serving the government. China did enjoy some periods of economic progress, several periods, quite substantial. But that was when the Chinese state, the tribute state, was fragmented or weakened. When the government kind of fell apart, commerce sort of popped up all over the place, economic progress took place, but each time it was somebody put back the empire and we went back to the sort of no progress situation. What is interesting is the most recent repetition of this pattern is modern China, okay? Mao put back together the empire, okay, in 1948, I think. And he very consciously imitated the structure of the classical tribute state. Okay, I think it was called the imperial state, but it's the same idea. Okay, he borrowed some ideas from the Soviets, but basically the Chinese communist system is the traditional Chinese government and Chinese economy. Okay. I told this once to a Chinese student in my office, and I said, in particular, what Mao did looks very much like the first Ming emperor, who also reestablished the empire after the Mongols and a bunch of other things. And this Chinese student said to me, duh, everybody knows that. The first Ming emperor was Mao's big hero. I didn't know that. But that's the story. So what happened? Same old, okay? When the Mao regime was weakened by the Cultural Revolution, things popped up. It started in the villages, not in the cities. In China, that's traditional. Okay, villages were freer than cities, and stuff usually started there first, and then moved into the cities. So it started this period that's recently undergone of really remarkable economic progress. It wasn't because Deng Xiaoping liberalized the economy. When he came to power after Mao's death, it was there already, okay? And he could have decided to squash it. But he thought, no, there's a lot of money there. Let's let this continue. It's interesting because the Sung dynasty, which is another example of someone who put the empire back together, they also inherited a thriving economy, and they decided the same thing. Why don't we help it rather than squash it? Okay, think of how much money we'll get from this. So that was Deng's decision, and it continued for quite a long time until Xi came along. And we're back to the traditional thing. It's more important to him to reassert control. Doesn't care what the cost is in terms, well, he does care, but it's worth it, okay, to reassert control. So again, you can understand China, what's happening this in terms of the predation trap. So that was the great enrichment or lack of great enrichment was the first question. The second one is, why are poor countries poor? So almost all of them have predatory governments, okay? And what is interesting is this sort of interesting literature on this. Sub-Saharan Africa, pre-colonial, largely had associational governments. They were very often based on tribes rather than on cities, but that was sort of the system, okay? It was bottom-up government, not top-down. The colonial governments, when they arrived, didn't like that and imposed their own predatory government on these territories, okay? And then when colonialism was overthrown, the independence movements did not reestablish the traditional associational government. They took over the predatory government of the colonial powers. So, the new boss, just like the old boss, essentially, was the story. Botswana is a rare exception. Botswana actually is much more like the traditional African government. So standard economics, we were just talking about this, I think, before the talk informally. Standard economics recognizes that government is the problem with economic development, but they just get the nature of the problem wrong. For example, the winners of this year's Nobel Prize in Economics have a book, Why Nations Fail, about failed states. And the problem is what they call a lack of state capacity. It's not that the government is too powerful, but it's not powerful enough to do all the good things that we want government to do. But what they don't get is this is predatory government. If it has more power, it will do more bad things, not more good things. Okay, so very mistaken. So I guess the predation trap has taken the Nobel Prize in Economics as well. The governments of poor countries are not failed. Okay, you only think they're failed if you don't understand what they're for. Right? I actually, when I was a graduate student, I think before your grandfathers were born, it was a long time ago, there was an economist from Stanford came to give a talk, and he said exactly this. You know, people go to developing countries, and they talk about the government being a failed government. And they think essentially government means government like ours, i.e. associational government. These are failed associational governments. They're not. They're highly successful predatory governments. The problem is not that they failed. The problem is that they're successful. They're doing a great job for themselves. That's why they're there. We saw that example in China, that what China succeeded with economic development, not when it had state capacity, but when the government collapsed. Okay, that's good. Okay, that was good news. All right. So what matters is not capacity, but what it's used for. Okay, if you're using your capacity for predation, it isn't particularly helpful. The final question that the Malthusian trap was used to address in Limits to Growth is, what is the biggest threat to our continued prosperity today? And so we said it's the Simon one is bet. It's not population expansion or limits of natural resources. It's the problem with government. Okay, we saw that the great enrichment happened as a result of the evolution and spreading of the form of government that I call the associational state, or we could call federal government, our form of government. Okay. And this is a form of government that is very hospitable to economic progress. Okay, and continued prosperity continue only if you can preserve this government in the form that is good. Okay, Benjamin Franklin, when he was asked, you know, what kind of government did they decide on in the Constitutional Convention, said, a republic if you can keep it. Okay, it's interesting that he said, if you can keep it. Okay, that's our problem, is keeping it. And it turns out it's not that easy to keep it. Because as I said a bit earlier, government too is susceptible to the predation trap. Okay, the people who are controlling the government, who are working for us, supposedly, in fact, tend to work for themselves. And they have, over the centuries, tried to amass and increase the power, okay? the power has been steadily centralized in the federal government. The federal government initially did national defense, and that was it. That was the Dutch Republic model. And that was also increasingly the model in the UK, okay? Everything else was done by the states at the local level. So the federal government over the years has steadily increased its power, taken on more and more responsibilities. There's a very good book about the process by Robert Higgs called Crisis and Leviathan. So every time there was a crisis, the Civil War, the First World War, the Depression, COVID, all of these things, the Fed said, we've got to have more power to deal with this. And then when the crisis was over, did they give it back? No. They just waited for the next crisis and took even more. Okay. So the current symptom of this degeneration of our government is an impending fiscal crisis. Okay, the thing we have to worry about is not running out of resources, but the world no longer being willing to buy our debt. Okay, the government has been on a spending spree for quite a few years, financed by selling bonds, government debt. Finance, again, used for the ill, not for the good. This cannot continue. Our debt continues to grow relative to GDP. At some stage, foreigners will look at this and say, the reason it's so popular is it's considered the ultimate safe asset. At some point, someone will think, you know, this stuff can't be safe. Okay, how are they going to pay this back? And then things will start to unravel. Okay. So we saw the ability of government to borrow was key to the evolution and the advantage of the association state, but it's been abused. Okay. Alexander Hamilton said, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. True. Okay. But it is excessive. It's becoming a national curse. Okay. Not to end on too negative a note, okay, remember the predation trap is kind of a cycle, okay? There's increasing predation that brings trouble, brings things down, but then the economy finds ways to get around it and to deal with it. So I'm hoping that once the crisis happens, and there's much more pressure on government, that will be the result. To quote Adam Smith, there is a great deal of ruin in a nation. Oh, there's a great deal of ruin in a nation, as he would have said it. Okay. Okay. So I just want to finish by putting this in the context of the series as a whole. Okay. I said last time that in standard economics, there are two entities that play critical roles in the economy. One is the market, and the other is government. Okay? But in standard economics, there's no discussion of what they are and how they work. Okay? Last time, in the first lecture, we talked about finance, which is an example of commerce, which is what creates and sustains and operates markets. Okay, that's the market, is really commerce. Today, we've looked at predation, okay, which is what underlies government. It's not all the government does, okay, but it's, if you don't understand its relation to predation, then you don't get it, okay? In standard economics, government is a fairy godmother. Okay, if there's a problem, just call the fairy godmother and she will take care of it. In reality, not so much, as I hope I've demonstrated. So government, so to understand the market, the activity is commerce. to understand it and how it works and what it does. For government, the activity is predation. Okay, not just doing it, but protecting against it. The basic function of our government is protecting us against foreign governments, okay, which would engage in predation. The later lectures, in the winter and spring terms, we will look at the implications and applications of these ideas in different contexts. Okay, thank you very much.
I have a few minutes for questions for Professor Kohn. Someone like to be first? Drew?
Yeah. I'm curious if you think taxation from the government is a form of predation. Under your definition, you said that it's using force to take things from
Yeah,
others.
it does fit that definition. It's the use of force to take stuff from people. But under associational government, that's generally with the consent of the governed. Okay, so the taxation, we don't want people not to do their bit. So sometimes there's at least a threat of force involved. What makes it predation or not predation is what they do with it. Okay, if they use this to support our national security, that's what we want. That's what they're there for. Okay, if they use it in other ways to buy votes, that's not so good. Okay, that's predation. And we don't have time to go into it really, but the predation of the government and on the government has sort of evolved over the centuries, and we have kind of a new version, which I call a commerce in predation. So our legislators and officials get their cut, not by taking, okay, but by being intermediaries, okay? They take from you and give to me, and I reward them. Okay, it's called redistribution, okay, or various other things. So that's sort of the way it's done in an enlightened economy. Yep. Okay.
Thanks.
Do you think during the period of imperialism, where
Yeah.
a lot of the Western countries were imperializing and colonizing in East and
Yes.
in Africa, do you think that increased the predatory nature of those colonizing countries, of countries like the US or England?
Did that increase what?
The predatory nature of the colonizing countries.
Well, I gave you the example of Africa. Africa, predatory government wasn't that common. I mean, there were empires in West Africa and so on and so forth. But a lot of Africa was essentially associational governments. And the colonial administrations were clearly predatory governments. And then the post-colonial inherited that structure, took it over under new management. That was the story. So I think that at least in Africa, the destruction, really, undermining of government is probably the worst thing that the colonial powers did to those countries, with the longest lasting ill effects.
Do you think that led to a more predatory government for the countries that were colonizing as well?
It's a good question. I don't know. That would be my answer. I don't think so. I mean, I don't think there's a long tradition of associational governments being predatory externally. Greece, Rome, yeah. So they were associational internally, but predatory empires externally. Okay, so yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
Judy? Hold on.
Hi, Professor. I just want to ask, like, when you mentioned China's growth wasn't like promoted by Deng's like open and reform policies, like it was there. He just didn't like suppress it.
Yes.
Is there any evidence that show like this kind of growth started before this?
Yes,
open
lots of
reform?
evidence. If you send me an email, I'll give you a bunch of books on the subject. Yeah.
And do you think that this
And I
was-
think it wasn't just that he allowed it, he wanted to help it. He thought it was good. So he did, it's not that he did nothing, but the results were only partly a result of how he helped. It was already going great guns before he arrived on the scene. Okay. And this, I think I mentioned the Sung dynasty was the same story. They sort of took over and they had a thriving economy and they didn't want to spoil it. Yeah, they're not stupid. Okay, yeah.
Hi, Professor. Do you think that associational governments need to be predatory externally to sustain economic growth?
No. I don't think Western colonialism did the economies of the colonial powers any good at all. I think, and there's a lot of work on this. They were actually a net drain on resources. It was kind of a vanity project. Britain wanted to have more than France and this sort of thing. And that was actually democracy had quite a bit to do with it because it was actually popular with the electorate. Okay, our empire. So it really only happened in the late 19th century when democracy was coming in to European countries. Universal suffrage democracy, everyone voting. Yeah. So blame democracy. There was someone over here, Hank. This guy has had his hand up a long time.
Hi, I was wondering, do you think that the resource curse exists? And if so, do you think it lends itself more to predatory or associative government?
I didn't hear the beginning of what you said.
Do you think that the resource curse exists?
Oh, no, that's an example of the predation trap. The resource curse is very much. So the resource curse is, why is it that developing countries with lots of resources do much worse than developing countries without a lot of resources? And the answer is, if there are a lot of resources, owning the government is very desirable. And you have a lot of conflict, civil wars, things like that, about who gets to steal the royalties from those resources. So that's the resource curse. And there's an argument that foreign aid is a form of resource curse. Who gets to divert the foreign aid to their Swiss bank accounts? If the country's getting a lot of foreign aid, it makes controlling the government much more attractive for you to steal stuff. Yeah.
In the past, it looked like associative governments could defend themselves rather easily. You said making fortifications and raising militia and such. In the development of modern, extremely destructive warfare, how does a small, growing associative government, like, for example, relatively small, like Botswana, preserve itself from internal or external takeover?
I don't really know. I don't. Yeah. Good question, but I don't really have an answer to that.
Other questions? If there are no more questions, then thank you very much, Mayor Kohn. And see you in January.